destiny is in our sights. America's future is in our hands. And the best is yet to come.
Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for The Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, your one-stop shop for news and analysis all about the Republican National Convention. Joining me right now is the Washington Post White House reporter, Toluse Olorunnipa. Toluse, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, great to be here. Good morning.
All right, so Toulouse, night 2 of the Republican National Convention. What are your first impressions? What stood out to you?
Well, we did see a bit of a shift between the first night and the second night. The first night of the convention was very dire. We heard a lot of warnings about mobs coming over to take over suburban neighborhoods and how if Joe Biden is elected, everything would essentially become chaotic and dangerous. And last night, we did hear the president's allies sort of try to shift the narrative to say the president wants more immigrants coming into the country, that the president is happy about redemption and making sure that people who have committed crimes get a second shot at life. We heard a lot of people sort of talking about the president's character and saying that he is a good and decent man, something we haven't necessarily heard a lot about. We heard from 3 of the president's family members of his children who spoke on his behalf, as well as the First Lady, Melania Trump, who gave a pretty well-regarded speech that not only touched on the president's accomplishments and his character, but also sort of the state of the nation at this moment. She was much more willing to talk about sort of racial grievances in the country and the fact that there are parts of the country's history that we're not proud of, not something that you normally hear the president say. So she was able to deliver a message that was a little bit different and softer than the very strident message that we often hear from President Trump. And I think the broader attempt is to paint a picture of the president that's not as offensive as the picture that he often paints of himself. And that was the argument, that was the goal that we heard from several of the people around the president. We have a couple more days of this convention, and we will hear from the president himself on Thursday. And he does have a history of sort of stepping on the message, the carefully crafted message of his aides by doing things and saying things that are offensive or headline grabbing. And we'll have to wait and see if he sticks to the script or if he sort of writes a new script when he speaks in a couple of days.
Well, I want to get to that point in a second. But one thing you didn't mention was the coronavirus. And I bring that up because you have a story in the Washington Post today with the headline, Trump uses Republican convention to try to rewrite coronavirus history, casting himself as life-saving hero.
Yeah, especially that first night. Over the course of the first 2 days of this convention, we've heard not as much about the coronavirus as we heard during the Democratic convention. They were happy to spend a lot of time focusing on the pandemic, the fact that more than 175,000 Americans have died. They laid that at the feet of President Trump, saying that he should have done a better job of handling this. President Trump has spent less time during his convention talking about it, but when the coronavirus was mentioned, he did sort of rewrite some of the history of this virus. He said the Democrats and the media and doctors were the one who got it wrong early on, saying that this virus is something that we didn't have to worry about, showing clips of Democrats in various states saying everything's going to be fine. He did not show clips of himself, which several times over the course of February and March and even into April, he was saying everything is fine, this is going to disappear. When it gets warmer, everything's under control. And a lot of public health experts have said that that was wasted time when the president should have been leading a national public messaging effort, telling people that they needed to stay home, that they needed to social distance when it became clear that masks would work, that they needed to wear masks. And instead, he equivocated about all of those things. He said everything was under control. He talked about miracle cures like hydroxychloroquine and injection of disinfectant and ultraviolet light. And the president's handling of this virus, if you look at polls, is one of the major things keeping him down in the polls. And rather than sort of addressing that, he tried to show the positive, put a positive spin on his response. And it did sort of go beyond sort of normal politics into broader revisionism. And that's why we wrote a story sort of correcting some of the record and filling in some of the gaps that the president and his allies left on the table when they talked about this on Monday.
Okay, now I got to get you to talk about what you said at the end of your first answer, and that is the president's speech on Thursday and what his allies say he's going to say or think he's going to say, and then what he's actually going to say, and then what's it going to do to step all over what he's about to say?
Yeah, there's a major difference that we've seen over the last 3.5 years between teleprompter Trump and off the cuff extemporaneous Trump, in which he's just sort of speaking his mind. When he's on the teleprompter at big moments, like some of the State of the Union addresses, he's been able to deliver a message that you could say is even sort of presidential in some ways, that is unifying in some ways. He does have speechwriters who can kind of put together a normal traditional presidential speech to focus on talking about his accomplishments without offending large chunks of the country. But when he gets into sort of riffing or just talking off the cuff, that's when he tends to say things that are a little bit controversial and tend to turn off a lot of voters. And it'll be a very interesting dynamic over the next couple of days as we see more of the president. He's been appearing on the screen on every day of this convention in some capacity. Thursday will be the day where he gives his keynote address. I do expect him to stay on the teleprompter for the larger chunk of the address, but it just takes one or two ad libs, especially with this president, to change the entire narrative, to focus on something that maybe him and his speechwriters did not want to be the headline coming out of the convention. So I would be paying close attention to what he says, both during his speech, but also when we see him in some of these unscripted moments. I think today we're supposed to see him having a meeting with coronavirus medical professionals. Does he continue to say that the virus is under control, that everything is fine, that schools should just reopen without having plans and whatnot? And if he does that, that does step on some of the message from what we've heard during the convention.
All right, Washington Post White House reporter Toluse Olorunnipa, thank you very much for coming on First Look this morning.
You got it. Thank you.
All right, let's cross over to the other side, to the opinion side, where my colleagues Catherine Rampell and Hugh Hewitt are standing by. Both are Washington Post columnists. Hugh, Catherine, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, actually, I'm going to start with you, Hugh. If you had one word to describe last night, what would it be?
Perfect. As a Republican, I think there are three audiences watching, Jonathan and Catherine. Mm-hmm. Trump supporters, Trump haters, and undecided. The Trump supporters, and I am one of them, loved it. The Trump haters were going crazy on Twitter last night. And I think Chuck Todd summed up for all of us NBC colleagues, I know Catherine's with CNN, when he said he's making inroads with African-American men, with the justice reform, with the citizenship, with a bunch of the speakers. So I just thought pitch perfect. And I honestly didn't think they had it in them. I didn't think they had the skill set. But I am very happy this morning.
Catherine.
You want one word? I guess I would say dishonest. Look, they were celebrating someone's record last night, but it sure wasn't Trump's. It was like they were living in this alternate universe where Trump didn't completely bungle the coronavirus pandemic by playing it down for months and claiming that 15 cases were going to go down to zero and requiring governors to flatter him in exchange for critical supplies. It's as if they were pretending we didn't live in a universe where unemployment is still at its highest levels in decades, higher than it is overall in the OECD, in our peer countries. They were living in this universe where Trump somehow revived an economy in recession under Obama, even though we were nowhere near recession under Obama. GDP growth under Obama in his second term was roughly equivalent to that under Trump pre-COVID, and then fell by about a third annualized last quarter. And in this universe where Trump has been pro-immigrant, astoundingly, where he's pro-political refugee, even though he's lowered the refugee ceiling to its lowest level ever, like 17,000 this year, when before it had never been below 70,000, I believe, or 80,000. So it was just like, I'm glad to hear that he's pro-immigrant. That's news to me, given all of his actual policies sealing off every available legal avenue for immigration, but it just does not reflect any of his record.
Hugh, I mean, this is an interesting point, and this is day two where I have heard, Catherine has said it, it's been my own observation, watching our colleagues on MSNBC and CNN talk about the fact that there seems to be there's the real world where the coronavirus is out of control, the economy is in trouble, and then there's the reality that's being discussed at the Republican convention. Um, I, I know you're a Trump supporter. You just said that, but is it? I mean, are we wrong to think that we're seeing an alternate universe being presented to us from the RNC?
Well, I respect both of you a great deal. I respect Toulouse, but I think maybe you want to go back and watch Nicholas Sandmann last night, because Nicholas Sandmann spoke for the America that does not see the world through the blue bubble that perhaps is coloring your guys' view of what is happening at the convention and in America. Now, I've lost a dear friend to COVID. Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, is a very dear friend. He suffered through it, as is his entire family. I'm very aware of what COVID has done. I'm also very aware of the failures that occurred early on in the COVID because of the CDC. I'm aware of what the Chinese Communist Party hid from us. I am aware of the good words and the bad words spoken by Andrew Cuomo and Governor Newsom. Governor Newsom and I are in correspondence. I think everyone in America, or not everyone, but I think the majority of Americans look at all elected officials and say they're doing the best they can. It's not perfect, but the original estimate of a $2 million casualty from the Imperial study is going to be about 200,000 around the time of the election, maybe 225,000. And many Americans will say that's horrific, that's Trump's fault. And many Americans will say that is terrific, Trump held it back, even though there's much sorrowing. I thought Melania Trump spoke from the heart last night when she offered her prayers and sympathy for the people who have died from COVID. And I believe the politicization of COVID is hurting the Democrats. Now, last night, when Nicholas Sandmann talked about the media, I saw on Twitter two reactions. The applause across red America, and I think that's geographically most of America, and all cap hysteria of blue bubble, blue check media. And I really think Washington Post opinion writers, what we do have to stay grounded in the fact there are two Americas, and I'm talking on behalf of one right now.
That sort of makes my point about the two realities that we're talking about. Catherine, to Hugh's point about America's reaction to President Trump and the coronavirus pandemic and the administration's response, are they doing the best they can?
Look, we have more people dying in this country than any of our peer developed countries. So either we are the unluckiest country on earth or we did something wrong. And it's bizarre to me that sometimes Trump is arguing that everything is great. Kudlow even referred to coronavirus seemingly in the past tense. That was awful, something like that. Sometimes we're over it, it's done. Sometimes it's the Democrats' fault. So I don't know how Trump can be responsible for all of the things that happened in the first 3 years of his administration, but somehow like Joe Biden is responsible for the last 6 months of Trump's presidency. It doesn't quite add up. But look, they're trying to spin this. They're trying to present whatever. They're throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall and trying to see what sticks. If the more optimistic version, sort of washing away the many deaths that we've had here, again, maybe not 2 million, which I think is a cherry-picked goalpost, but higher per capita than in other peer countries. Sometimes they want to pretend all of that didn't happen. Sometimes they want to say, acknowledge that yes, it's awful. And I'm actually quite glad that Melania Trump expressed compassion for the families that have lost loved ones during this epidemic, this pandemic. I think that was a necessary message, and it shouldn't only be coming from Melania, for that matter. Sometimes they want to, suggest that it all is well. Sometimes if it's not well, blame the other guy. And I guess they're just hoping to see what sticks, again, regardless of what the facts are.
Catherine, let me get you on something else that was notable about the convention last night, and that was the inclusion of a speech by the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, which shatters all precedents when it comes to a Secretary of State being involved in a political event like this. It shatters norms, but is it illegal?
Look, I am not a lawyer nor an expert on the Hatch Act, but my understanding from talking with people who are more fluent in that law is that at the very least, it was a violation of norms. It may well have been a violation of the law, but I'm not an expert in this issue. But there were a number of actions last night besides that either teetered on the wrong side of the law. If we're talking about the Hatch Act, not just Pompeo's speech, of course, the naturalization ceremony, which was conducted at the White House for a political event. USCIS employees were recently warned not to do anything political in the context of their work. This was a blatant violation of that by their boss, who is, by the way, also determined by the GAO to be serving illegally in that job. So there were a lot of legal questions raised there. And beyond that, of course, the Trump administration, because of delays in naturalization, despite the 5 people who were sworn in last night, there are potentially hundreds of thousands who will be disenfranchised in this election because their naturalization process has been put on pause because of delays and closures within USCIS. And the use of the Rose Garden. So there were a number of issues, appearances last night, and uses of government resources that were flagged as potential violations of the Hatch Act. Will Americans care? I think they should care about the law, but I'm not sure that they will. I'm not sure that they're going to know about the nuances of these things, even if they are interested in it. And I think it's a shattering of a norm at the very least. On the legal side, I think it's troubling, but I don't know that Americans are going to bother with it, unfortunately.
Hugh, I saw you raise your hand, and I was coming to you on this also because I was, when Catherine was answering, I was looking for my notes and my papers, and there's a report that even Secretary Pompeo's own State Department said that the speech was illegal. And I should have pointed out that Congressman Joaquin Castro, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, said in a statement on yesterday, that, quote, the American people deserve a full investigation into the United States top diplomats address to the Republican convention. I'll ask you the same question I asked Catherine. This certainly busts norms, but the State Department says that it's illegal. Is it illegal from your perspective?
Well, my perspective is as of a lawyer, Jonathan, and as of the former deputy director and general counsel of the Office of Personnel Management and the acting director of OPM, which administers the Hatch Act, and as a former member of the White House counsel's office. And the answer is no. None of those things are illegal. Neither was President Obama picking the bracket at ESPN or Mike Pompeo, which is unprecedented. But then again, it's unprecedented for the president to have moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and the United Arab Emirates and Israel treaty is unprecedented. So one always has to look back at things that they find uncomfortable, or perhaps they wish they'd thought of themselves, and put it in the context of the law. Here's the law. It had to have gone through Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, because that's what we used to do when I served in the Reagan's White House counsel's office. I was the junior briefcase carrying lawyer for Fred Fielding. But I want to assure everyone who's wringing their hands on Twitter, they ran it all up. It's all fine. And you'll find Lawrence Tribe, who are very estimable, or you'll find someone else out there to say violation, violation, violation. But just because they say it loudly, it ain't so. No one does that without concern for that. And I don't know what State Department person said what, but Mike, who's a very good friend of mine, is a Harvard law graduate, was #1 in his class at West Point, and also has a fine legal staff, as does the RNC, as is Mr. Pat Cipollone at the White House, with a team of 20 lawyers. So I think it's nonsense. I think what we have to look at is that the Democrats didn't get to produce this convention. The Republicans did. It's always an advantage for the incumbent president to have control of the White House, of Air Force One, and of the means of being head of state and head of government. And it's not illegal. And the Hatch Act, by the way, cannot control the president of the United States, and explicitly cannot control the president of the United States. So I just want to caution everyone who's watching. I'm sure Catherine is sincere and you're sincere. It just ain't so.
Hugh, so then given what you just said, why do we even have a Hatch Act?
Oh, because we got to have a Hatch Act to make sure that people on the GS-14 level, after the Government Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 made civil service protections new and stronger. The Hatch Act itself was reformed to allow more political activity, not less, by government employees, because a certain number of public employee unions especially wanted to be free of the very restrained strictures on the First Amendment rights of citizens. And I go back as a constitutional law professor and say, let's look at the First Amendment right. Let's see what people are allowed to do in this country, and freely express their views is what they ought to be able to do, unless they're on the job and unless their job has to remain apolitical all the time. And we have loosened the Hatch Act to make sure that people do get to freely express their deeply held opinions, to wear buttons to work. When I was leading OPM in 1988 and 1989, we had a much more restrained Hatch Act than we do now, but it's been rewritten to allow for more political expression. I don't expect, Catherine, you to know that. That's deep into the law and deep into the weeds, but just don't trust Twitter lawyers. Twitter lawyers, not only are they restrained to 240 characters, they often are simply letting politics speak as opposed to the law.
I don't know if anyone is paying attention to Twitter lawyers as opposed to just lawyers. Catherine.
Yeah. It's not just
go ahead.
It's not just random people on Twitter. It's, crew and all sorts of other folks who also consider themselves experts. Again, I'm not an expert in this, so I'm not going to try to make a ruling. I'm just reflecting the fact that there are people who disagree.
Well, Catherine, the one area where you are, Hugh, Catherine, one area where you are an expert is the economy and jobs, and as you were mentioning before, GDP. Last night was all about, not all about, but part of the discussion was about the economy and bringing things back, or I guess from the perspective of some, it's back. Again, the reality as being presented at the RNC, well, let me ask you the question. Is the reality being presented at the RNC through the Republican convention, does it reflect the reality in the numbers?
I think it depends on who you are. So if you are a higher wage, white collar worker, college educated, the recession is basically over for you, in the sense that the jobs that were lost earlier in the spring have been recovered. You can work from home. You can get deliveries of everything you need and want. Your 401k is up because you probably have retirement money saved. So you're doing okay. If you are among the so-called forgotten men and women whom Trump has long said he champions, you are not doing okay. And the numbers reflect a completely different set of circumstances. Unemployment rates are higher. About a third of the jobs that were lost have still not been recovered. If you are unemployed, your unemployment benefits have been slashed recently, probably by about 60%. You're facing potential eviction, food insecurity, bankruptcy, etc. So if you're talking about the narrative of the economy is great, there is a portion of the country that's doing okay, maybe better than okay. But those are not the people Trump usually says he emphasizes, right? He kind of rode into office in 2016, or he won the election in 2016, on the argument that Washington fat cat elites were ignoring the plight and the financial struggles of the working class. And that's exactly who is suffering right now. So, if you're painting this rosy portrait of America, those people don't belong in that portrait right now. Now, maybe they will eventually. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. The virus is still in charge. Maybe once infection rates slow down, for example, people will be able to come back to work in higher numbers, but probably a lot of our employment infrastructure has been destroyed. A lot of businesses have gone out of operations for good. So I think that there are reasons to maybe signal more of a note of caution, or a sense that you are mindful of the struggles that still face a significant portion of the electorate right now. And I don't know that that's been reflected. I get that they want to present an optimistic image of America. We are an optimistic nation, but in some ways it feels a little bit tone deaf to me to downplay or ignore wholly the struggles that a large portion of Americans are facing.
Well, actually, that's a very good point. Good point, Hugh. Catherine says that it's tone deaf. Do you think it's tone deaf? I mean, for those people who have been majorly impacted by the coronavirus pandemic in terms of whether it's their health or even their jobs and their economic livelihood, is what's coming out of the Republican convention resonating with them? Or do they feel left out?
Far from tone deaf. I think it's perfect pitch. Whether it was Mayor Basalovich of the Iron Range in Minnesota, whether it was Joyce, Lobsterman Joyce, Jason Joyce, my favorite speaker last night from down east, who spoke about being a Democrat voter 4 years ago and a Trump supporter now. Susan Collins must have been popping the champagne. Chris Peterson, the dairy farmer in Wisconsin, who spoke about how she and the entire dairy industry has roared back. So far from being indifferent to people, the Republicans, surprisingly enough, have highlighted Republican success stories among people who've come over to the Trump side. And surprisingly enough, the focus on the Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and on swing states like Maine is what a Republican convention's going to do. So I don't know what you guys expected them to do. There are lots of people suffering in America, but they're out talking about what's worked, and Larry Kudlow being upbeat is just the same Larry Kudlow I've known for 30 years. You should just watch a replay of last week if you're disappointed, because they got all that stuff in. The Republicans are talking about the Super V.
Okay,
Catherine,
so let's
I saw you raise your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, let's talk about the dairy farmer and the lobsterman. Again, not the reality that the country is facing. Wisconsin, which was supposed to be, the success story based on this speaker last night, last year still had the highest number of farm bankruptcies in the country, still driven by dairy farmers. I think farm bankruptcies in Wisconsin were up 20% last year over the previous year. So maybe they found one person who's doing well, but again, not reflective of farmers overall or even farmers in that person's state. Same deal with lobster. If you look at the lobster industry has actually been doing much worse under this president than the tail end of the Obama presidency. Why? Because of the trade war. The #1 biggest export market for American lobster farmers was China. And because we had this trade war with China, which I think you're hard pressed to say we got anything out of it, given that the much vaunted trade deal that was finally signed, China is not actually keeping to at this point. They've only accepted about half of the commitments that they're supposed to as of this point in the year. In any event, China slapped tariffs on lobsters and stopped buying them. So lobster prices plummeted as a result of Trump. So I'm very happy for that one farmer who's doing well, but it's not reflective of the industry. And these are easily fact-checkable things. You can Google it. I encourage people watching to Google it. Look at the numbers for lobster exports, or look at the number for Wisconsin farm bankruptcies. So saying that these people are reflective of successful Trump policies is just, it's in a different universe.
Real quickly, Hugh, real quickly, because we have less than 2 minutes.
All right. The EPA, and I have to declare that my son works there. Andrew Wheeler was in Maine this week to remove an onerous Obama-era regulation on the lobster industry, which has been applauded by the entire lobster industry. And earlier today on my radio show, Congressman Mike Gallagher from the 1st District of Wisconsin rebutted everything Catherine said about the dairy industry, which is in fact thriving in Wisconsin under the new USMCA. So you can Google that too. Again, where you sit is where you see. What I saw last night was a celebration of success. I'm very confident about Wisconsin. Minnesota, I'm looking very good for Trump. And I think Maine is going, and Susan Collins is going to win re-election. I think Donald Trump's going to carry at least half of the congressional district, which is how they do it there. Google it all.
I'm not even going to ask another question, because between Catherine and Hugh, we could be here until the convention starts up again tonight. Catherine Rampell, Hugh Hewitt, thank you very much for coming on First Look at the Republican National Convention.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. with Washington Post White House reporter Phil Rucker, deputy editorial page editor Ruth Marcus, and Washington Post columnist Charles Lane for more RNC news and analysis. Coming up at 11:30 this morning, Washington Post Live will speak with Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Ben Carson, followed by a conversation with Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson. And then starting at 3 p.m. Eastern, we'll feature back-to-back interviews. First, with House Minority Whip Steve Scalise, followed by Chair of America First Action Linda McMahon. You can register to watch these interviews at WashingtonPostLive.com. In the meantime, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Washington Post Live. Have a good rest of the day. Get some coffee.